Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the review for Legends of Arkain, Orc Number 1, by Shar Dundred. This is the first and only Orc book that has been released currently, and this is the second campaign in the installment of the Legends of Arkain series. Now, in this review, which I don't suspect will be particularly long, compared to the first one at least, I want to talk a bit more about like an abstract conversation about custom content, and talk about my experience with Warcraft 3. So this will actually be a bit more of a subjective experience, recapping this stuff. Primarily, I think the reason that I want to do this is to add a little bit of humanity to the commentary, because I have seen a few people, notably Shar Dundred himself, react very strangely and emotionally to the feedback that I've been giving and the reactions that I have had. And I also wanted to add a little bit of color to people who think that maybe I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to Warcraft 3 specifically, and, just to add a little bit of life there. I also think that it's not really worth getting into the objective aspects of the Arkain Orc book. I guess the only thing that I would talk about a little bit more at length objectively would be like the storytelling and how it feels even worse than the human book, and even less fitting than the human book storytelling. But ultimately, that does veer a bit more towards the subjective because I have refrained from bothering to analyze the story too heavily, even in the past review. However, all of the objective commentary that I provided in the review of the first human book, I think still rings true in this Orc book. You still have a lot of pre-placed units. In fact, I would say more, but maybe I was just noticing them more than when I was playing the human book. It's just very grind-based, slow-paced gameplay, where the gameplay loop is actually like fighting the system of feedback, or not feedback, upkeep, and constantly trying to get to the point where you can mine a bunch of unmine-outable, impossible to deplete gold mines, and eventually break the enemy through, spamming out a bunch of units and high supply counts and stuff. But upkeep works against that, so it doesn't feel like a cohesive project in terms of how you're meant to solve the gameplay problems, right? How you're meant to interact with the AI. It feels almost like you're supposed to be fighting the, integrated gameplay system. So there's a lot of problems that I think are mimicked in that sense from the human campaign. I don't really feel like there was much of a progression here. And then, of course, there's micro missions, and they aren't done well. So I think a lot of the objective analysis that you can take from the human campaign, you can apply it to the Orc campaign. So I apologize for anybody who wanted me to basically repeat myself in this particular case, addressing specific things about the Orc campaign, because I don't think I'll be doing that here. I don't really think that the Orc campaign was different enough from the human campaign experience-wise. It was very much a similar experience. And so if you liked the human campaign, you're probably going to like the Orc campaign because it's basically the same thing, just using orcs. And they don't play that differently from humans that it's a significant difference in terms of the end-user experience. And if you didn't like the human campaign, you're not going to like the Orc campaign because it doesn't do anything better than the human campaign on a foundational technical level. The gameplay systems are not changed at all, and so no lessons seem to have been learned. Which means that if you were already in a position where you were appreciating Arkain for what it was when the human campaign came out, and you weren't expecting anything better from the Orc campaign, then maybe you'll be satisfied. Otherwise, I don't think that the Orc campaign is for anybody. So I'm actually getting my recommendation out there pretty quickly. If you enjoyed the Orc campaign, or the human campaign rather, you'll enjoy the Orc campaign. If you didn't, I would avoid it. Now, when it comes to the actual production, and like the development process, I'm not really sure what Shar Dundred's process actually is. I keep almost calling him Arkain for some reason, so I apologize if I slip up later on in the review and call him Arkain instead of Shar Dundred. His name is Shar Dundred. That's his username. Make no mistake about it. He is the man, the myth, the legend. And he and some other people, I think not necessarily just to me, but have reacted very emotionally to feedback that was critical. Or perhaps were even attacking the campaign, like when you'd get some people who would provide some sort of commentary, some sort of review, some sort of analysis, and they would nitpick or critique certain things. A lot of the times, I feel like they would be attacking the wrong thing. They'd be going at it from a very different perspective, right? Like I hit the roots in the human campaign talking about how the AI doesn't interact with us the same way that we can interact with them. The challenge in these missions is never centered around outplaying the AI. It's about taking advantage of how stupid they are, and that obviously tells a very poor story, as well as being really annoying and not uninteresting and unengaging in most cases. The Orc campaign does have a few notable examples of very silly things, like an invulnerable undead base that throws attacks at you randomly, which the characters never acknowledge. The general insane amount of pre-placed units, the number of paladins that have divine shield at 45 seconds. There's like a lot of stuff that feels that it was placed there with express purpose to frustrate players, as opposed to like inadvertently frustrating players by including them. It seems like that was their only purpose, because that is their only utility, is to add grind, add time, force the player to conform any strategy they want to have around even, into an even narrower sort of slot. Otherwise, they will not be able to actually pass the mission. And so, as a result of that, I feel like the Orc campaign is in many ways worse than the human campaign in that respect. It feels even more removed from the melee gameplay. I am not as uninitiated into Warcraft 3 gameplay, even high-level gameplay, as I may seem, especially if you looked at how poorly I played these missions. I do certainly acknowledge that I am not the best Warcraft 3 player, but I don't think that Legends of Arkain actually tasks you with playing Warcraft 3. For one, there's very little item play, and for another, the tech trees are different, although not enough to make a massive difference in terms of it doesn't feel different to play as necessarily. The tools at your disposal, a higher level player would definitely be in a very different position because they would be used to the default melee gameplay and they'd have to adjust to that, whereas I'm not used enough to playing high level melee or melee at all for it to really bother me that much that there's a bunch of changes. But I watch a lot of high level play on the ladders. I have watched some tournaments in the past, although those are a little bit less exciting to me than the StarCraft tournaments, just because Warcraft 3 is a less of an exciting game to me. Usually if I'm watching Melee Warcraft 3, I tend to watch it at double speed, for one, to save time, and for another, because it actually does end up looking like a more compelling game that way. But I understand that this is a subjective thing. Some people do prefer Warcraft 3 over StarCraft 1 from Melee's perspective or whatever. I just wanted to say that, allowing you guys to understand, I do actually follow the Melee, and especially the most recent patches, I do understand that the game was very different not so long ago when it comes to the Melee. And I feel like that actually adds a bit of credence to what I say when I talk about how, it doesn't really feel like I'm playing Melee. Because even though I have played Melee, admittedly not as much as maybe some of the other people on the Hive Workshop, or the people who maybe even had some hand in making this campaign. I have no idea how much Shardundred has played Melee, for example. I do recognize the gameplay pattern of Melee and how it's very, very different. I have some ideas in mind, actually, as to how you could even tweak any campaign, be it this one or another, in such a way that it actually, favored Melee play a little bit more, and it wasn't as much of an abstraction on it. But of course, I don't believe that Shardundred actually wanted to make something that reflected Melee. At least my understanding of his design philosophy, based on reverse engineering it from his, campaign, it feels to me more like he's in the boat that, he wants to make something that's not a Melee experience, that's not anything like a Melee experience, and that's why he's done the things that he's done, and why he's, made it so that workers don't cost supply, and gold mines never run out, and, basically all the decoration on his maps are trees. That's what it's like, man. So, I wanted to talk just about the understanding of Legends of Arkain and the understanding of how it differs from the Melee gameplay. And that's why I said it was going to be a bit more of an abstract conversation about custom content. Because if you look at, for example, the StarCraft content that I play, a lot of those maps don't actually differ that much from Melee gameplay, because usually they very rarely change the tech tree. For example, tech tree editing is not something that you'll see very frequently in StarCraft campaigns at all. I think the most recent one to do it to any significant degree would be I think in 2017, or it might have been last year, I'm not sure which, but the Reaver Menace, I believe it was called, by iQuare. So that campaign actually did a fair bit of tech tree changing. It basically gave you a custom faction. I can't remember if it changed much about the other two races, but it basically gave you a custom faction that was layered on top of Protoss technology. And so this was, I think, cool to a lot of people because they hadn't really seen it that much. But the tech tree played very differently than default Protoss as well, and it favored a different playstyle. It basically gave you a new playstyle that was very new to the game because, of course, none of this technology existed back then. None of this tech tree actually existed prior to this mod coming out and offering us, a campaign with which to play as this faction. And so, as a result of all of these changes, you wind up in a situation where you have to explore what the best strategies actually are. And they are entirely surrounding not the gimmicks of the maps, at least maybe some of them were, but for the most part, the snippets that I saw of this content seemed to me like, you could just throw players in a melee-styled map, but with this custom tech tree, and now you would have to figure out what the best strategies were to use with that race. Maybe some units were overpowered or underpowered or whatever. Certainly balance may come into effect as an issue, but the bottom line is that it has a very different playstyle. Now, obviously, with the humans in Legends of Arkain, when you were playing as humans, it didn't really give you much to work with if you were trying to come up with different playstyles or different build orders or different tech trees or whatever, because for the most part, the tech trees were very similar to the vanilla game, although obviously the dwarf tech tree was very different. In some respects, they still had like bear riders, which were basically knights, and they still had, obviously they had riflemen, they had footmen, or they had a footman equivalent, which was just a dwarf hero, a dwarf unit. No real balance changes to speak of. Although, annoyingly, as I found out when massing wyverns in this particular orc campaign, there are some significant balance changes and imbalances designed entirely around that crossbowman unit, where it has normal armor and more health than the footman. So I think it's 500 HP, but the veteran ones were even more annoying to deal with, where they had like 11 armor or something with 3/3 upgrades. So a lot of stuff, again, feels like it's basically just wasting your time. So when it comes down to it, you're in a position where your experience playing in a melee style, where you're trying to use a certain combination of units, isn't really that different. I guess with the Orc campaign it was a bit more because you had so many spellcasters. The spellcasters of Arkain tend to be more different than any of the other units that are quote-unquote new. Like, again, the Bear Rider is just a knight. I think it even has the same or similar stats. It has the same upgrade as the knight with animal war training. So you would look at that and you would say, okay, that's not very different. But then you look at the spellcasters, okay, there is a significant difference there. And certainly those do sort of play out differently. And I tried to experiment with them a little bit more this time than I did in the human campaign. Although I didn't really feel like I could build too many strategies around them. It obviously was very imbalanced to have, say, Bloodlust and Unholy Frenzy on the same faction, while also having access to a hero that basically was a mobile Fountain of Life. But the Fountain of Life hero was a little bit more hit or miss because he wasn't in every mission. That being said, basically the gameplay of Arkain is not that far removed in most cases from using units that are familiar to you in role if they're not actually titled the same thing or have the same graphic as a unit that is from vanilla, like, again, the Bear Rider, or in this case, like the Wind Rider. So when you're looking at it from the perspective of somebody who's coming from a melee environment, and whose primary experience playing Warcraft 3 is a melee environment, which is most people, I would say. I don't think there's too many people who have only played custom campaigns and very rarely played melee, and most custom campaigns don't change the tech trees that much. The reason why I brought up StarCraft is because, by comparison, even the ones that changed the tech tree a little bit, like my own Project Hydra back in the day, in 2018, so many days ago, actually. Obviously, that did change the tech tree somewhat, and you didn't have access to Brood Warrior technology. So there were some significant differences in terms of playstyle, but I basically tried to facilitate the same playstyles as you had already had by giving you upgrades that healed infantry over time and stuff, so that you would still be able to play bio. And similar things to promote like more Wraith play or whatever. That was probably like the most significant change out of all of them, is that you could build Wraiths and actually have them be useful against ground units, for example, while maintaining their usefulness against air. And so, while I kind of made them a more like catch-all unit, sort of like a ubiquitous unit, it still was a significant enough change, I think, to the metagame, where you'd go like Wraith tank or something, and that would be pretty good against Terran AI-controlled enemies. But generally, playing StarCraft is not that different from playing StarCraft Melee. Like a StarCraft custom campaign, even with a mod, is usually not that different from playing the Melee game, whereas Arkain, the map construction is what sets it apart from Melee. It's not so much the tech trees. That's why I labored so much time on the tech trees, because, again, Arkain is meant to be a unique setting, and yet the tech trees themselves don't play that differently. I guess it's closer to like Hydra, where some strategies will be newly created and others will be newly outmoded. Or impossible, depending on what units are available. But the tech trees aren't really the biggest component there. It's the level design. It's the amount of pre-placed enemies. It's the fact that they start out with full upgrades. It's the fact that they never run out of money. It's the fact that they basically only engage with you by attacking. They never try to expand and get more map control. Leaving the game with a bunch of towers will, you come back 20 minutes later, maybe a couple of them are destroyed or whatever. Or maybe genuinely you have lost, but odds are, the AI themselves will not have rebuilt anything that you've destroyed. If it was like a main town, they will not have expanded out into your territory by taking more expansions or something like that. They're just not programmed to do that, so they just sit in their bases. Now, this is like my foundational issue with Arkain, is that it never really engages with you. It's very non-competitive. It does not compete for your time. It does not compete for your map control or anything like that in game, and it doesn't compete for your time out of game. So it feels like many times you'd sit there and you wonder, why are we in the middle of playing this, right? What's going on here? And I feel like that's really the point to bring home. That is the main crux of the issues with Arkain, is that for the most part, it not only does it not compete for your time, the way that the AI engages with you is either by ways that you cannot, have any, there's no reprisal possible, like the invulnerable undead base, for example, although that is a bit more of an extreme, rare occurrence or whatever, something like that, an extreme case. You also have the idea that, generally speaking, the AI will never run out of money. And so you're in a state of perpetual psychosis where it's a perpetual stalemate until you can throw, the sixth group of Wind Riders or the seventh mixed group of whatever units you've got. Basically, you're just constantly rebuilding armies, because not only will they never run out of money, but you will rarely ever run out of money because your gold mines last so long. And so you could easily be stuck in a single mission for 2 hours and with barely anything changing until the final few moments, just because it's such a slog, it's such a grind. Now, maybe there was some hidden strategy or something that would have solved all of my problems and I just didn't know about it. But for the most part, I think that you're in a position where you are stuck doing whatever it is you are doing, fighting whatever enemies you happen to be fighting, and competing against whoever you've been put up against just forever until, they finally capitulate by you destroying their altars as their heroes are rezzed, and their production structures as they constantly throw broken crossbowmen at you, and all this other weird stuff where it doesn't really feel like you're playing an RTS. It doesn't really feel like you're playing Warcraft 3, even an abstraction on Melee, just because the AI is always just not engaging at all. It's always just sitting there, doing what it's doing, but not in a way that a player would, not a way that a Melee AI would. Just, it's following a pre-programmed set of directives that are almost always mass up this number of units and attack an enemy nearby. And that's usually the extent of the AI. They also have defense forces that are usually pretty busted, but aside from the defense forces, I imagine the AI for Arkain is very, very small in terms of what its actual scripting is, and not necessarily saying you have to have some really highly complicated AI, but you should probably try to make it so that they engage the player with more than just a few attack waves here and there, because if they're just going to be, okay, I'll put it to you this way. I can understand the problem that is left behind by only attacking the player and not having a significant amount of pre-placed defense junk. And the problem is, you will be in a position where the player will rebuff the enemy attacks and then attack the AI, and they won't be able to rebuff the player's attacks unless they have a bunch of pre-placed stuff that doesn't also get used for attack waves. But the way you do that is by making it so that the AI competes for map control, and so that the AI expands outwards and tries to fortify their positions within reason, and uses a significant amount of their forces to attack, which increases the likelihood that the player is unable to fend off that attack and get vibrated in the middle of delivering a review. So, that's basically everything that I wanted to say anyways. So it's okay that I got vibrated, I guess. It was a nice little reminder to not go over the 20-minute mark on this particular review. But ultimately, because the AI never competes for map control and never tries to take anything away from you when it comes to gold mines, resources, or whatever, it doesn't use those resources. It just sort of sits there and takes whatever gold mine they've got, 1 gold at a time, which is very, very silly. They follow a preset of whatever instructions to defend and to attack, and otherwise they don't engage with the map at all. They don't engage with their enemies, if they're AI enemies or you, and they don't engage with their allies to help defend or whatever, except for a strange set of circumstances that I think was just the AI trying to attack in that sea head mission, Melon, whatever that guy's name was. And that's really the extent of their interactions with you. And the AI is the main source of interaction in any RTS, in any game most of the time. And so you really want to make sure that you're hitting that home in single-player content or co-op content or whatever it is. And that is why I always labor the point about AI. But I hope that I was able to provide you with enough anecdotes and enough background about me as a player in Warcraft 3 to give you an understanding of where I'm coming from when I talk about my content. I talk about my opinions about content and that sort of thing. And again, just as a brief reminder, I mean, none of this is meant as like a personal attack. We might go overboard in the middle of getting drunk on in like the last orc stream or whatever, but for the most part I feel like we're pretty respectful about the creators themselves. It's just that it's easy to get a little frustrated when you know that your time is being wasted and the developers didn't put any thought into it other than, hey, we need some content here, let's fill it up.